The boys of jihad had already entered France, where they conquered the ancient Roman province of Septimania, southwestern France without much difficulty, moved into Aquitaine, and pressed on. The people of southern France were poor, could offer little in the way of booty to the invaders, so the Muslims began despoiling churches and monasteries, as well as the popular shrine of St. Hilary of Poitiers, taking what they believed to be their due from the treasure of the infidels. There was another shrine that was the favoured site of pilgrims, contained a good deal of silver and gold, that of St. Martin of Tours, in north-central France. In 732, the Muslims, under the command of Abd-ur-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, governor of Al-Andalus, proceeded to march there. Frankish authorities, seeing their advance, were not sure if the jihadists constituted simply a raiding party determined to carry away the loot of St. Martin's shrine or an actual invading force. Ultimately, however, there was little difference. Inspired by the exhortations of the Quran and Muhammad, the boys of Islam ultimately intended to seize and hold every bit of land on earth, and were determined to continue their jihad wherever and whenever possible. Whether they intended to hold Tours in 732 or not, they intended to do so eventually, and advance further as far as the land and sea would take them. In any case, it was the Muslims who made a far greater miscalculation, drastically underestimating the strength of the forces that gathered between Tours and Poitiers to stop them. The commander of their forces was a Frankish duke named Charles, who gained the name Martel the Hammer for his decisive victory there. 25th of October 732 was a bitterly cold day, and the Franks routed the jihadis who had come dressed for Spanish summer. Al-Ghafiqi and the remnants of his army beat a scorched earth retreat back to Al-Andalus, burning and looting everything in its sight. But the Franks would rebuild. The Muslims' defeat was near total and would be total before long. In 734 they lost Avignon in southern France, and not long thereafter were driven out of France altogether, even as they were strengthening and consolidating their hold on Spain. The Battle of Tours in 732 may have stopped the complete conquest and Islamization of Europe. The warriors of jihad would appear again in France, but they would not come close again to gaining control of the whole country until many centuries later, by vastly different means, when there was no longer Charles Martel to stop them. The Muslim warriors had traversed immense distances. In all of Europe there were, in the early 8th century, no significant force that could have stopped them, were it not for the Battle of Tours. 18th century English historian Edward Gibbon envisioned the continent's complete Islamization had the Franks lost at Tours thus. If this victorious line of march had been prolonged above 1,000 miles from the Rock of Gibraltar to the banks of the Loire, the repetition of an equal space would have carried the Saracens to the confines of Poland and the highlands of Scotland. The Rhine is not more impassable than the Nile of Euphrates, and the Arabian fleet might have sailed without a naval combat into the mouth of the Thames. Perhaps interpretation of the Quran would now be taught in the schools of Oxford, and their pulpits might demonstrate to circumcised people the sanctity and truth of the revelation of Mahomet. One 20th century European, however, was disappointed that Charles Martel had destroyed the forces of Islam warriors, for the same reason that Gibbon was relieved. The man expressing that regret was Adolf Hitler. The setbacks of the Muslims in Central Asia and Western Europe led to increasing dissatisfaction with the Umayyads, who were finally overthrown by a rival clan, the Islamic revivalist movement, the Abbasids, in 750. The Abbasids gained supporters by arguing that they had a better claim to the caliphate than the Umayyads did, as they were members of Muhammad's household, descendants of his uncle Abbas ibn Ad al-Muttalib, while the Umayyads were descendants of Abu Sufyan, the Quraysh chieftain who had fought Muhammad at the Battle of Uhud and the Battle of the Trench. This line of reasoning, had the Abbasids followed it to its logical conclusion, would have led them to acknowledge that the Shiites had the best claim of all to the caliphate, as their imams were descended from Ibn Abi Talib, Muhammad's son-in-law. Of course, they did not go that far. The Abbasids also accused the Umayyads of impiety and promised to rule strictly in accordance with the Quran and teachings of Muhammad, and so it was that they defeated the Umayyads in several battles and finally captured and killed the Umayyad Caliph Marwan ibn Muhammad on 6th of August 750. Abbasid warriors cut off the impious Marwan's head and sent as a trophy to the Abbasid Caliph, the pious Abu al-Abbas. Almost immediately it looked as if Allah was favouring the Abbasids and blessing their siege of the caliphate. In July 750, at the Talas River on the border of present-day Kazakhstan and Kurdistan, the forces of the new caliphate met those of the Chinese Tang dynasty in what was to be the decisive battle for hegemony over Central Asia. China's westward expansion was stopped, and the region was definitively secured for Islam. The Buddhist and Christian presence in Central Asia went into rapid decline. The area would be Islamic ever after. Meanwhile, the Umayyads, vanquished as they were not prepared to vanish from history. Abdul al-Rahman, an Umayyad prince and the grandson of the Caliph, Hisham ibn Abdul Malik, escaped Abbasid assassination squads and flew to Al-Andalus, where he succeeded in gathering a force of Muslims who did not want to give their allegiance to the Abbasids. Ultimately, he established himself as Emir of Cordoba and continued to pursue jihad warfare against the Christian domains in Spain. The Abbasid Caliph Mansur was not willing to take the loss of Spain lightly, directed the commander Ibn Mughathith, who was stationed in North Africa, to invade Spain and destroy the Umayyad upstart. Abdul al-Rahman, however, captured Ali bin Mughith and other Abbasid commanders, had each beheaded and then had their heads placed in finely decorated boxes that were sent to Mansur. In the box containing Mughith's head, al-Rahman placed Mansur's letter ordering his North African commander to go to Spain and fight al-Rahman, along with a fragment of the black flag of jihad that Mansur sent Ali ibn Mughith to be his standard. Mansur, receiving this macabre package, murmured, "Thank Allah there lies the sea between Abdurrahman and me," and made no more attempt to secure Spain for the Abbasids. The ongoing war between the Christians and Muslims in Spain became part of Western Europe's foundational legend and myth. In 778, the grandson of Charles Martel, Charles, the King of the Franks, who became known to history as Charles the Great of Charlemagne, led an expedition into Spain at the invitation of a group of Muslim rulers who would not accept the authority of al-Rahman. Hussein, the governor of Saragossa, Suleiman al-Arabi, governor of Barcelona and Girona, and Abu Tor, governor of Huesca. They promised fealty to Charlemagne if he would then aid them against al-Rahman. Charlemagne, like so many Christian leaders, much later lulled into complacency by their Muslim partners, interfaith dialogue, trusted them and went on the march. When Charlemagne arrived at Saragossa, however, al-Arabi offered him his fealty as promised, but Hussein did not, claiming that he had never agreed to do so, and the gates of the city were not opened to him as promised. Charlemagne's forces laid siege to Saragossa, but when the Frankish king learned that the Saxons were revolting against his rule in northern France, he opted to abandon the siege and retreat across the Pyrenees. On his way out of Spain, however, Charlemagne's men destroyed the walls of Pamplona, the city of the Basques, out of fear that forces opposed to the king were coalescing there. In revenge, the Basques, probably allied with some Muslim forces, ambushed the Franks at Rendezvous Pass, inflicting more severe losses on Charlemagne than he suffered at any other time in his career. Over time, as century after century passed, filled with aggression from the warriors of jihad, the Battle of Rendezvous Pass became, in legend, a Muslim ambush on Charlemagne's retreating army. In the 11th century, 300 years after the battle, the French epic poem known as the Song of Roland appeared, describing the heroism of Charlemagne's nephew Roland, who was leading the rear guard of Charlemagne's forces to grew up in the Muslim ambush. Roland has an oliphant, a horn made of an elephant's tusk, which he can use to call for help, but he initially declines to do so, thinking it would be cowardly. Finally, Roland does blow the horn. Charlemagne, way ahead of the rear guard, nonetheless hears Roland's horn and hurries back, but it's too late. Roland and his men are dead, and the Muslim victorious. Charlemagne, however, pursues and vanquishes the Muslims and captures Saragossa. Thus the legend, the Song of Roland, was enormously popular and inculcated in the Christians who sang and celebrated it in what came to be known as knightly virtues, loyalty, courage and perseverance, even in the face of overwhelming odds. These were virtues that would be needed if Europe was to hold out against ever-advancing jihad. Some Christians were ready to display those virtues. In the late 770s, the Abbasid Caliph al-Mahdi travelled to Aleppo, where 12,000 Christians greeted him with great honour. Al-Mahdi, however, was not disposed to respond in kind and told them, "You have two options, either die or convert to our religion." Most of the Christians chose to die rather than embrace Islam. In and around Baghdad, he noticed that the Assyrian Christians had built new churches since the Muslim conquest, in violation of the Dhimmi laws. He ordered them destroyed. 5,000 Christians in Syria were given the choice of conversion or death. Many stayed true to their ancestral faith and chose death. However, loyalty, courage, and perseverance were not always in evidence. In 782, al-Mahdi sent his son Harun al-Rashid into Byzantine territory. Harun swiftly advanced, taking 7,000 Christian slaves and getting all the way to Chalcedon, right across the Bosporus from Constantinople. He seemed on the verge of achieving what the warriors of jihad had tried and failed to do twice before: conquer the imperial city and destroy the Eastern Roman Empire. However, the Byzantine Logothete Staurakios was able to move Byzantine troops to a position east of Harun's forces and surround the Muslims, cutting off their path to return to the Caliphate. Harun's position seemed desperate, but then he received help from an unexpected quarter, another in a long and continuing line of short-sighted and opportunistic non-Muslims who saw the jihad as their chance to line their pockets or improve their standing. The Byzantine Empire at this point was riven by the iconoclast controversy, a fierce dispute over whether it's permissible or proper to create and venerate images of Christ, Mary, or the saints. The Byzantine general Tacitus, an iconoclast, feared that the iconodule empress regent Irene was going to dismiss him. She was indeed removing iconoclasts from positions of influence. In the jihadis' advance, he saw an opportunity. With Harun's army encircled, Tacitus deserted and joined the Muslims, taking much of his army with him. This momentous desertion was kept secret so that Harun could use Tacitus to lure Staurakios and other Byzantine officials to the negotiating table. When the Byzantines arrived for the negotiations, Harun took them hostage and used them as bargaining chips to extract favourable terms from Irene. Harun was ultimately able to proceed unmolested back to Abbasid domains, taking with him a substantial sum of Byzantine gold and Irene's promise to pay the Muslims 70,000 dinars in jizya each year for the next 3 years. Harun rewarded Tacitus by appointing him governor of Armenia. During his 23-year reign as Abbasid Caliph, Harun al-Rashid invaded the Byzantine Empire 8 times. Each time he demanded the submission of the territories his armies entered. If the Christians refused, his forces would plunder the area thoroughly. Meanwhile, the jizya still came annually from the imperial court in Constantinople. In 802, however, the Empress Irene was deposed and exiled, and her successor, Nicephorus, sent envoys to Harun in Baghdad with a defiant message. It is said that Irene considered you as a rook and herself as a pawn, that pusillanimous female submitted to pay a tribute, the double of which she ought to have exacted from the barbarians. Restore therefore the fruits of your injustice, or abide the determination of the sword. After they had delivered this message to Harun in his legendary sumptuous court in Baghdad, Nicephorus' messengers sent through a bundle of swords at the caliph's feet. Harun reacted coolly. He smiled, unsheathed his scimitar, and declared, "In the name of the most merciful God, Harun al-Rashid, commanded the faithful, to Nicephorus, the Roman dog, I have read thy letter, O thou son of an unbelieving mother." In 806, Harun made good on his threat, leading a massive Muslim force into the Byzantine Empire. At Cilicia in southern Asia Minor, he ordered 16 churches demolished and used their stones to shore up the fortifications along the border between the Caliphate and the Christian Empire. Near Samosata in southeast Anatolia, he ordered all the churches in the area to be destroyed. At Kaysan, the Muslims destroyed a magnificent church with 15 altars that was said to have been constructed by the apostles of Christ themselves. They used the stones to build a fortress at the town of Hadath. At Tyana in Cappadocia, Harun had a mosque built, the declaration of his intentions to hold and Islamize the area. And he kept going, destroying not just the Christian churches, but also Byzantine fortresses wherever he could. Harun advanced with alarming speed across Asia Minor, getting as far as Heraclea Pontica, just 175 miles from Constantinople. Nicephorus, thoroughly alarmed, saw that he was going to have to eat his words. It was he, not Harun, who was going to have to abide by the determination of the sword. He sued for peace and agreed to resume paying the jizya. Harun, according to the 9th century Byzantine chronicler Theophanes the Confessor, was immensely pleased, as the money was a token that he had subjected the Roman Empire. Nicephorus also agreed not to rebuild the fortresses that they had destroyed, but once Harun withdrew, he rebuilt them anyway. Harun, hearing of Nicephorus' perfidy, seized the city of Sebasta, Laconia, and the island of Cyprus, where he destroyed all the churches and forcibly resettled the Cypriots elsewhere. As Harun carried out his jihad campaigns, he heeded the advice of a Muslim jurist, Abu Yusuf, who advised him: whenever the Muslims besiege an enemy stronghold, establish a treaty with the besieged who agree to surrender on certain conditions that will be decided by a delegate, and this man decides that their soldiers are to be executed and their women and children taken prisoner. This decision is lawful. This was the decision of Said B. Murad in connection with the Banu Qurayza. This decision made by the chosen arbitrator, if it does not specify the killing of the enemy fighters and the enslavement of their women, and children, but establishes a poll tax, would also be lawful. If it stipulated that the vanquished were to be invited to accept Islam, it would also be valid and that they would therefore become Muslims and free men. It is up to the Imam to decide what treatment is to be meted out to them. He will choose that which is preferable for the religion and for Islam. If he esteems that the execution of the fighting men and the enslavement of their women and children is better for Islam and its followers, then he will thus emulate the example of Muda. Muda was the companion of Muhammad who pronounced the judgment that the men of the Qurayza Jewish tribe be executed, and the women and children enslaved, after which Muhammad beheaded between 600 and 900 men. None of this has become part of the legend of Harun al-Rashid. According to the historian Karen Armstrong, al-Rashid was a patron of the arts and scholarship, inspired a great cultural renaissance. Literary criticism, philosophy, poetry, medicine, mathematics and astronomy flourished, not only in Baghdad, where the Abbasids had placed their capital, but in Kufa, Basra, Jundavaba and Haran. In the West, al-Rashid may be the best known of all the caliphs, and his name is generally associated with cultural advancement, scholarship and poetry. After the Arabian Nights brought his name and legend to the West, he became a mythical philosopher king on the order of King Arthur. Lord Tennyson and William Butler Yeats celebrate him in verse. Even the novelist Salman Rushdie, in hiding after the Islamic Republic of Iran, offered reward a fatwa for his murder for his 1988 novel The Satanic Verses, followed up in 1990 with Harun and the Sea of Stories, in which the two main characters are called Harun and Rashid, in a tribute to Rashid, and an Islamic culture that Rushdie considered more enlightened than that of Khomeini. Yet al-Rashid had another side. History does not record how many Christians and other non-Muslims this most enlightened of caliphs subjected to lives of misery and slavery and degradation, or to immediate death after defeat in battle. No one at his opulent court looked askance at this. The subjugation of the conquered peoples taken for granted, it was the will of Allah. The warriors of jihad had not given up on France in the aftermath of the Battle of Tours. In 791, the Umayyad Emir of Cordoba, al-Reda, the son of al-Rahman, declared jihad against the Franks and determined for good measure to strike a hard blow against the nagging problem of the Christian kingdom of Asturias. He led 40,000 jihadis across the Pyrenees and advanced as far as Narbonne and Carcassonne in southern France, but was unable to go further or hold the territory. He did, however, carry back an immense haul of plunder, 45,000 gold coins and many enslaved Christians. When his men sacked Oviedo, the new capital of the kingdom of Asturias, they added even more to it. To show his gratitude to Allah for this bounty, Hisham gave a large part of the gold to finance the construction of the Mosque of Cordoba. By this time, the jihad in France was largely over, at least until the 21st century. Elsewhere, however, it was just beginning. In 825, 10,000 Muslims from Al-Andalus took to the sea and began to engage in the jihad of piracy, raiding infidel ships in search of booty and setting the pattern for jihad pirates down through the ages, including the Barbary pirates who waged war against the newly independent United States, and the Somali pirates who terrorized the waters around East Africa in the 21st century. Eventually they landed in Alexandria, where they plundered churches and Abbasid mosques, both considered to be the domains of infidels at war with the rightful Islamic authority, the Umayyads of Cordoba, and seized and sold 6,000 Christians as slaves. Driven out of Alexandria in 827 by the Abbasid Caliph al-Mamun, pirates set their sights on Crete, an outpost of the Byzantine Empire. The Muslims thought they were merely plundering the island until their chief Abu Hafs took a page from Ibn Zayd's book and set fire to their ships. The jihadi soldiers were enraged. Abu Hafs, however, quickly mollified them, saying, "Of what do you complain? I have brought you to a land flowing with milk and honey. Here is your true country. Repose from your toils and forget the barren place of your nativity." The jihadis counted, "And our wives and children?" Abu Hafs had a ready answer. "Your beauteous captives will supply the place of your wives, and in their embraces you will soon become the fathers of a new progeny." The idea that the Muslims might lose doesn't seem to have entered anyone's mind. Apparently convinced by Abu Hafs' promise of beauteous spoils of war, the jihadis began to fight for control of the island. A former monk who had converted from Christianity to Islam led them to Chandax, an area of the island that was suitable for the construction of a fortress. The Byzantines were quickly defeated. The Emperor Michael II, the Stammerer, alarmed at the loss of a land so strategically placed in the Mediterranean, sent several expeditions to recapture Crete, but none were stressed successful. Abu Hafs established the emirate at Crete, giving nominal obeisance to the Abbasid Caliph, while essentially ruling his own. The emirate of Crete would be a thorn in the side of the Byzantines for the next century and a half, harassing Byzantine shipping in the eastern Mediterranean and serving as a base for jihad raids elsewhere until it was finally recaptured in the Byzantine offensive in 961. The Muslim conquest of Sicily began the same year as the conquest of Crete, 827. As with the jihad into Spain, a renegade Christian was its impetus. According to legend, a young man named Euphemius had become entranced with a young cloistered nun. Unable to control himself, he kidnapped her from a cloister and married her, all against her will. News of this outrage reached the ears of the Emperor Michael himself, who stammered out that the lust-drunk libertine Euphemius must be punished by having his tongue cut out. Euphemius was not resolved to suffer such a punishment in silence. He fled Sicily, but knew that wherever he went in Byzantine domains he was likely to be caught and punished, even more severely than Michael had ordered. He went instead to North Africa, where he appealed for help from the Muslims, who were happy to oblige. Euphemius returned to Sicily in style, 10,000 new friends and 100 ships. While initially successful, Euphemius and the Muslims soon encountered fierce resistance, and the traitor Euphemius was killed. By 829, the jihadi invaders had been almost completely driven off the island when they received unexpected help, an invading Muslim army from Al-Andalus led by Asbah ibn Waqil. Although they ultimately took Palermo, the Muslims were not able to secure the eastern part of Sicily, stymied both by the ferocity of the native population and their own inability to unite their various factions. The fighting went on for decades. In 878, the Muslims finally took Syracuse, and the booty was immense. According to Gibbon, the plate of the cathedral weighed 5,000 pounds of silver. The entire spoil was computed at 1 million of pieces of gold. Along with the treasure, the Muslims enslaved over 17,000 Christians. The exact number is not known, but according to Gibbon, it exceeded the number of the 17,000 who were captured and sent to Africa to lead lives of slavery when the Muslims took Taormina. The warriors of jihad were finally able to secure complete control of Sicily in 902. The conquerors treated their new domains with extreme severity, brutally suppressing the Greek language and forcibly converting thousands of young boys to Islam. The successors of Harun al-Rashid continued the jihad against the Byzantine Empire, but for a considerable period this took the form of raids into Byzantine territory in Asia Minor, in which the Muslims would recapture treasure and slaves and then return to the Caliphate. In the 830s, the Byzantine Emperor Theophilus asked the Abbasid Caliph al-Mamun for a peace accord, but al-Mamun's response hewed to the Islamic tripartite choice for the people of the book and made it clear yet again that the Muslims were not fighting the Byzantines simply out of desire for conquest. I should make the answer to your letter the dispatch of cavalry horses, bearing steadfast, courageous and keen-sighted riders, who would contend with over your destruction to seek God's favour by spilling your blood. They have the promise of one of the two best things, a speedy victory or glorious return, but I consider that I should proffer you a warning with which God establishes clearly for you the decisive proof of Islam, involving the summoning of you and your supporters to knowledge of the divine unity, the divine law of the religion of the Hanifs. If you refuse, then you can hand over tribute, which will entail the obligation of protection and make incumbent a respite. If you choose not to make the payment or ransom, then you will clearly experience face to face our martial qualities to an extent which will make any effort of eloquent speaking and exhaustive attempt at description superfluous. Peace be upon him who follows the divine guidance. To al-Mamun's bellicose message, Theophilus prudently did not reply. Then, perhaps recalling Muhammad's dictum more with deceit, al-Mamun set out to harass Theophilus in a different way. In Cilicia, in southern Asia Minor, a Christian approached the Caliph and convinced him that he was Theophilus' son and would be his vassal. Al-Mamun gave him a costly bejewelled crown and ordered Job, the patriarch of Antioch, to consecrate the impostor emperor of the Romans. Job, knowing that his choice was to go along with the charade or be killed, complied, consecrating the new emperor with full pomp. When the patriarch of Constantinople heard about what had happened, he excommunicated Job. Al-Mamun and his sham Byzantine emperor kept up the pretense for 2 years, but when they saw that none of the Byzantines were falling for the impostor and rising against Theophilus, they gave it up and the false emperor converted to Islam. In 833, Al-Mamun ventured into Byzantine territory and made significant gains. He retook the city of Tyana for the Muslims, where al-Rashid had built a mosque, which the Muslims had evacuated when Nicephorus sued for peace. When he had originally conquered it in 831, al-Mamun had ordered the city destroyed, after which the Muslims again withdrew from the area. When he took it yet again in 833, however, al-Mamun realised its value as a fortress and base for further operations against the Byzantines, and ordered it rebuilt yet again. According to the 12th century chronicler Marcus the Syrian, he started to rebuild it through taxes demanded from the country so harshly that every tongue cursed him. Al-Mamun, if he heard these imprecations, was undoubtedly unmoved. It was the will of Allah that the dhimmi people of the book pay for the upkeep and works of the Muslims, but shortly thereafter the Caliph died suddenly and unexpectedly at the age of 47 after eating green dates while relaxing on a riverbank. Not long thereafter, two Muslim commanders, Nasir and Babak, converted to Christianity, with a portion of their troops and offered themselves to Theophilus' service. Theophilus, delighted and emboldened, conducted several raids into Caliphate territory. Al-Mamun's successor Caliph Al-Mutasim was enraged. He led a huge army into Asia Minor, conquered Ankara, and proceeded on to Al-Murium, a major city at that time, which he put under siege. After 12 days, a Christian prince named George betrayed the city, allowing it to fall into Mutasim's hands. The Caliph gave full vent to his rage upon the city's inhabitants. The Muslims raided the monasteries and took thousands of nuns and sex slaves, killed 18,000 people, destroyed the city's churches. Then Al-Mutasim's son, Daud, a devout young man, prevailed upon his father to restrict the lives of the captive Christians even more than they had been already, forbidding funeral processions, church bells, the open display of the cross on church buildings, the public desecration, celebration of the divine liturgy, and the consumption of pork. With the exception of the last, these became part of Islamic law for the treatment of Christians in Islamic lands. Yet even after this, Theophilus again tried to make peace. He sent the Caliph gifts and asked that he exchange Byzantine prisoners for Muslim ones. Al-Mutasim sent the emperor gifts in return, but rejected a one-for-one prisoner exchange. It is not the Arab custom to exchange one Arab for Byzantine, since the Arabs have greater value. It remains part of Islamic law to this day that the life of a Muslim is worth more than that of a non-Muslim. A manual of Islamic law certified as reliable by Al-Wazar, the foremost authority in Sunni Islam today, specifies that the indemnity paid for a Jew or Christian is 1/3 the indemnity paid for a Muslim. The indemnity paid for a Zoroastrian is 1/15 that of a Muslim. Theophilus agreed to an unequal prisoner exchange, and for a brief period there was peace in Asia Minor. As the jihad against Sicily continued, Muslims also began jihad raids on the Italian mainland. In 846 they attacked Rome, the grandest city in Christendom aside from Constantinople, but were unable to get through its walls. The basilicas of St. Peter and St. Paul outside the walls, however, as the latter's name indicated, were outside the city's defences. The jihadis plundered both, taking as much silver and gold as they could, including a sumptuous silver altar from St. Peter. With finding Rome's walls too strong to breach, they continued down the Appian Way to nearby Fondi, which they plundered, and Gaeta, which they besieged. Although the jihadis had left the immediate vicinity of Rome, the people in the great city were thoroughly alarmed. Despite the Romans' inability to break through into the heart of the city, the Romans criticised Pope Sergius for not doing enough to keep the city safe. When he died in 847, his successor, Pope Leo IV, swiftly began shoring up Rome's defences, building new walls and repairing the existing ones, as well as repairing the damage the Muslims had done to St. Peter's and St. Paul's. That all this was necessary was taken for granted by everyone. The jihadi forces were still in Italy, and the threat was urgent. It had not yet become customary for the Roman pontiff to proclaim the peacefulness of Islam and benign character of the Quran, and decried the building of walls. If anyone had been sceptical about the need for Pope Leo's new walls, they were no longer so. In 849, when Muhammad Abu Abbas, the emir of the Aghlabid dynasty that ruled in North Africa, ostensibly under the authority of the Abbasid Caliph, sent a fleet to the mouth of the Tiber River, just 16 miles from Rome. Leo, however, had formed an alliance with several Italian princes, as well as with the Byzantines, and a significant Christian force was there to meet the forces that the Christians called the Saracens. In the Battle of Ostia, a district of Rome, and aided by a storm that destroyed much of the fleet, the Christians were victorious, and the conquest and Islamization of Rome was prevented, at least for the foreseeable future. Elsewhere the Christians were not so fortunate. Gibbon recounted the habitual savagery of the conquerors. It was the amusement of the Saracens to profane as well as to pillage the monasteries and churches. At the siege of Salerno, a Muslim man, chief, spread his couch on the communion table, and on that altar sacrificed each night the virginity of a Christian nun. As he wrestled with the reluctant maid, A beam in the roof was accidentally or dexterously thrown down his head. The death of the lustful Emir was imputed to the wrath of Christ, which was at length awakened to the defence of his faithful spouse. Meanwhile, the Christians who were living in the domains of the Caliphate demonstrated why it was so important for the Christians elsewhere to resist the jihadi onslaught. The 11th century Muslim historian al-Maliki noted that in the 9th century a Qadi, which is a Sharia court judge, compelled the dhimmis to wear upon their shoulder a patch of white cloth that bore the image of an ape, for the Jews, and a pig, and to nail onto their doors a board bearing the sign of a monkey. These were not singular instructions issued at only one time and in one location. This was pure racial attitude from the Muslims. They were a very racial, superiority group in those days as well as today. In 850, the Caliph al-Mutawakkil issued a decree designed to make sure that the dhimmis knew their place and that the Muslims knew how to keep them at the place. It has become known at the command of the faithful that men without knowledge or discernment are seeking the help of dhimmis in their work, adopting them as confidants in preference to Muslims, giving them authority over the subjects, and they oppress them and stretch out their hands in tyranny, deceit and enmity. The command of the faithful, attaching great importance to this, has condemned it and disavowed it. Wishing to find favour with God by preventing and forbidding this, he decided to write to his officers in the provinces and the cities, to the governors of the frontier towns and districts, that they should cease to employ dhimmis in any of their work and affairs, or to adopt them as associates in the trust and authority conferred on them by the command of the faithful and commit it to their charge. Do not therefore seek help from any of the polytheists and reduce the people of the protected religions to the station which God has assigned to them. Cause the letter of the command of the faithful to be read aloud to the inhabitants of your district and proclaim it among them, and let it not become known to the commander of the faithful that you or any of our officials or helpers are employing anybody of the protected religions in the business of Islam. He was not innovating, he was extrapolating all this from the direction of the Quran itself. From chapter 3 verse 28, let not believers take disbelievers as friends and protectors rather than believers. And whoever does that has nothing to do with Allah except when taking precaution against them in prudence. The Caliph was determined to ensure that the dhimmis lived in a constant state of humiliation, as befitting those who had rejected Allah, and to be readily recognisable for what they were, so that they would not be mistakenly accorded respect by an unwitting Muslim. While he issued the decree above, according to Tabari, the Caliph also gave order that the Christians and the dhimmis in general be required to wear honey-coloured hoods and girdles, to ride on saddles with wooden stirrups and 2 balls attached to the rear, to attach 2 buttons to the caps of those who wear them, and to wear caps of a different colour from those worn by the Muslims, to attach 2 patches to their slaves' clothing of a different colour from that of the garment to which they are attached, one in front on the chest, the other at the back, each patch 4 fingers in length, and both of them honey-coloured. So it shows us, brothers and sisters, that they've always retained this kind of racial superiority complex. This is how racial they are, these Muslims. They're very, very racial, and they always have been, because their book commands them to be so. Those of them who wore turbans were to wear honey-coloured turbans. If their women went out and appeared in public, they were only to appear with honey-coloured headscarves. He gave orders that their slaves were to wear girdles, and he forbade them to wear belts. In the second half of the 9th century, the jihad against infidels largely gave way to jihad against Muslim rivals. The Abbasid Caliphate was beset with internal strife, with 4 caliphs ruling between 861 and 870, as rival factions vied for power. In the mid-9th century, the Abbasids were so weakened by the internal divisions that the Byzantines were able to go on the offensive and recapture the provinces of Illyricum, Greece, Bulgaria, northern Syria, Cilicia and Armenia, which had previously lost to the jihad. Despite all their dissension and disunity, however, the Abbasids still had the time and energy to continue to persecute the Shiite minority. The Caliph al-Mutawakkil forced the 10th Shiite Imam, Ali bin Muhammad al-Naqi, to move from his home in Medina to Samarra, which the Abbasids had made their capital in 836. Don't you think their names are ridiculous, brothers and sisters? I can't even pronounce them, nor can any others. Once he had him close by, al-Mutawakkil had al-Naqi mistreated, ridiculed and tortured. Al-Mutawakkil died in 861, but the persecution continued until the Caliph al-Mutaz bin Allah had al-Naqi poisoned to death in 868. His successor was Imam of the Shia, ibn Ali al-Askari lived under house arrest in Samarra until his death, also by Sunni poisoning, in 874. Shiite tradition holds that the prophecy that the 12th Imam would be the Mahdi, the saviour figure of Islam awaited by both Sunnis and Shiites, was widely known, so al-Askari was kept under wraps lest he father a son who could claim the title. Shiites believe, however, that he managed to have a son anyway, although there are different traditions about who his wife was, where she was from, and no one is sure how she got to the Imam under the watchful eyes of the Sunnis. However it happened, the 12th Imam, Ibn Hassan al-Mahdi, was born, and great things were expected of him. However, his father was killed when he was just 4 years old, and soon afterward, the long-awaited boy himself disappeared, probably also murdered by Sunnis like most of the Imams before him. In the Shiite view, however, he went into occultation, unable to be seen by ordinary human eyes, but still very much alive. 4 men known as the special deputies claimed to be in contact with him, and they led the Shiite community for the next 70 years, always in an atmosphere of persecution from the Sunnis. The return of the 12th Imam and the triumph of the Shia over the Sunnis and all infidels became a staple of Shiite apocalyptic literature. Meanwhile, schism among the Shiites caused more trouble for the Abbasids. The 6th Imam, al-Sadiq, who reigned from 733 to 765, designated his son Ismail Jafar as its successor. Ismail, however, died before Jafar did, and so Jafar was succeeded by his brother, Musa ibn Jafar al-Qazim. However, part of the Shiites believed that since the Imams were infallible, Ismail was the rightful successor of Jafar, as Jafar would not have designated him otherwise, and that the Imamite belonged not to Musa, but so to Ismail's son, Ibn Ismail. This Shiite group came to be known as Ismailis, and they were beset by internal divisions too. In the late 9th century, one group of Ismailis, known as Karmatians, after their founder Hamdan Karmat, preached an apocalyptic vision centered upon the imminent return of Ibn Ismail as the Mahdi, the saviour figure of Islamic apocalyptic literature. The Karmatians were fierce and fanatical, seeing even the pilgrimage to Mecca as idolatrous, because while the pilgrims venerated the black stone of the Kaaba, the sacred meteorite that Allah, it is said, has thrown down to that spot from paradise. In 899, the Karmatians captured Hajar, the capital of Bahrain, and established Bahrain as their stronghold, setting up a utopian society with no Friday services and indeed no mosque at all. Apparently they jettisoned Islamic practices in anticipation of the Mahdi's arrival and the consummation of all things. 30,000 black slaves did the work, and another 20,000 served as the army. No taxes were levied, as the community relied on plunder for its sustenance. The Karmatians were energetic in pursuing their plunder. The Karmatians began raiding the caravans of pilgrims to Mecca. In 906 they killed 20,000 pilgrims who had returned from Mecca, and in 924 massacred another pilgrim caravan. They also began seizing Abbasid strongholds, sacking Kufa in 925 and coming close to taking Baghdad in 927. In 928 the Karmatians struck their mightiest blow yet against Abbasid power. They stormed Mecca and stole the black stone from the Kaaba, carrying what they considered a focus of idolatry back to Bahrain. The theft of the black stone signified, the Karmatians said, the end of Islam and the commencement of the age of the Mahdi. They were, however, willing to return it for a ransom back to Mecca, but the Abbasids never made any effort to pay up. Finally, in 950, on the orders of the Fatimid Shiite Caliph, who had established himself in Cairo, whose authority they had accepted, the Karmatians threw the black stone into the great mosque of Kufa in central Iraq, along with a note saying, "By command we took it, and by command we brought it back." It had been in 3 pieces when it was taken, perhaps from the impact of being thrown into the mosque, now broken into 7, but fragmentary or no, it was still the black stone, or the closest thing to the black stone that anyone actually possessed. The Abbasids, no doubt, breathing a sigh of relief that it had finally been returned to Kufa, restored it to its place of veneration at the Kaaba in Mecca, and that was that. Abbasid power was severely shaken, but the jihad imperative remained, and would eventually be taken up again. There you have it, brothers and sisters, episode 3 of my history of jihad. I hope that you learned more and more from this series as I continue to talk about the history, and I pray that anyone who is a Muslim listening wakes up and accepts Christ as his saviour. I hope you all enjoyed it, brothers and sisters. God bless you all. See you on the next episode.